I work in monitoring systems. Most days follow the same pattern. Reports come in, I verify the data, I confirm whether the issue is real, then I pass it along if it is. Most of the time, the problem is already known, or it's easy to identify. The city runs on constant noise. The systems I watch are designed to measure it, not question it. That's why this one stood out. The report came through near the end of my shift, buried under routine maintenance logs. No urgent flag, no priority request, just a repeated failure tied to a single block in the middle of a high-traffic area. Traffic sensors were returning incomplete data. That happens. What didn't happen was how it was being classified. Instead of listing a specific fault, the system labeled it as environmental interference. That's usually a placeholder, used when data doesn't match any known pattern. Most of the time, it gets ignored, overwritten once the issue resolves itself. This one hadn't resolved. I opened the raw logs and went through them manually. At first, it looked like standard signal inconsistency. Vehicles detected, movement recorded, pressure sensors active. Everything indicated normal traffic flow, but the audio data didn't match. There were gaps, not distortion, not low input, entire sections where the system had been recording, but nothing was captured. No ambient noise, no residual signal, just empty segments inserted into otherwise normal data. I checked for corruption. There wasn't any. I ran the logs again, focusing on timestamps instead of content. That's when the pattern showed up. The gaps weren't random. They appeared at consistent intervals, spaced out in a way that didn't align with traffic cycles, signal timing, or anything else I could cross-reference. Same duration, same spacing. I marked the time. Then I checked the previous day's report. Same pattern. That's when it stopped feeling like a technical issue. I pulled older records tied to the same location. Enough to establish history. Scattered reports over several years. All flagged the same way. Sensor anomalies. Environmental interference. Incomplete data. Every single one marked unresolved. No follow-up, no escalation, just closed and archived. I leaned back and let one of the recordings play in real time. For a while, everything sounded normal. Traffic moving through the intersection. Distant voices. Background noise layered the way it always is in that part of the city. Then it stopped. No transition, no fade. Just silence. A few seconds later, the sound came back exactly where it left off. I replayed it. Same result. I didn't write anything down right away. I just listened to it again, focusing on the moment it dropped. There was no warning, no distortion leading into it. It didn't behave like something failing. It behaved like something being removed. I checked with one of the technicians. He didn't look up from his screen. Said it was probably interference, maybe construction, maybe calibration drift. Suggested logging it as a minor fault and moving on. That would have been the normal response. But the timing didn't match interference, and construction doesn't erase sound completely. I opened the map and located the block. Dense area, commercial, constant movement, no listed disruptions, no active permits nearby that could explain signal loss. On paper, nothing about it justified the data I was looking at. I hovered over the close report option for a few seconds. Then I canceled it. Instead, I assigned the case to myself. There wasn't a clear reason to do that. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't affecting operations in a way that required immediate action. But the consistency in the pattern suggested something structured, something repeating. Before logging off, I checked the timestamps one more time. Every gap followed the same spacing. Exact. I marked it, didn't label it as anything yet, just noted it. Then I closed the file and stepped outside. The city sounded the way it always does. Engines, voices, distant construction, everything layered together without interruption. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. Not to the noise itself, to how consistent it was. Because whatever was happening in that report, it wasn't just missing sound. And for the first time, I had the sense that it wasn't a system failing. It was something operating inside it, quietly, and on a schedule. I got there just after mid-morning, when the city settles into its usual rhythm. Traffic steady, sidewalks active, nothing unusual for that part of the area. If I hadn't been sent there, I wouldn't have looked twice. I parked a block away and walked the rest. Standard procedure. Observe before entering. Establish a baseline. From a distance, everything held together. Engine noise, overlapping conversations, distant construction, layered sound moving the way it should. I paused at the corner and checked the recorder. Levels were stable, no dropouts, no interference. I stepped forward. At first, nothing changed. Then something did. It wasn't obvious. No clear cutoff. No sudden silence. Just a gradual shift in how sound behaved. The noise didn't get quieter. It felt contained, like it wasn't traveling as far as it should. I took another step. The difference became more noticeable. Engines passing through the intersection still produced sound, but it didn't carry beyond a certain point. Conversations blurred faster than they should have. The distance between source and perception felt shortened. I stopped and turned slightly, comparing directions. Behind me, the city sounded normal. Open, layered, continuous. Ahead, it didn't. I marked the position and checked the recorder. Input levels were active, but unstable. The display fluctuated without any visible change in the environment. I adjusted the sensitivity. Ran a quick reset, checked the backup unit. Same behavior. I didn't log it yet. I wanted to confirm it wasn't device-related. I moved forward again. The transition continued gradually. No boundary line, no physical marker, just a steady reduction in how far sound extended from its source. By the time I reached the middle of the block, everything felt closer than it should have. Not physically, structurally. I spoke once just to test it. My voice didn't echo. It didn't carry past a few feet. It stopped almost immediately after leaving my mouth, like it had nowhere to go. I didn't repeat it. Instead, I wrote it down. Then I noticed the movement. Traffic was still passing through the intersection, but not the way I expected. Vehicles entered without hesitation. But their speed changed slightly once inside the block. Nothing extreme. Just enough acceleration to shorten the time spent crossing it. I watched 3 cars pass. Same pattern. They didn't slow down. They didn't stop. They moved through. Quickly, pedestrians behaved differently. Most of them adjusted their path before fully entering. Some stepped closer to the buildings. Others crossed earlier than necessary. A few passed through the center, but none of them lingered. No one hesitated. No one looked around. I picked one at random and stopped him just before he reached the edge. I asked for directions to an address inside the block. He answered immediately, pointed straight ahead, then stepped around the space he had just indicated and continued walking. No pause. No correction. I watched him go. He didn't look back. I checked the time and marked the observation. Something else felt off. The air. It wasn't colder or warmer, not heavier either, but it didn't move. There was no cross-current between the buildings, No shift when vehicles passed. Even light debris on the ground stayed in place. I tested that, took a small piece of paper from my pocket and dropped it. It fell straight down, didn't move after it hit the ground. A car passed less than a meter away. No change. I marked that too. Then the recorder flickered. Just for a second. The display froze, then resumed. I checked the backup again. Same result. Active input. Unstable reading. I looked down the length of the block. From where I was standing, everything still appeared normal. Traffic moved, people passed by, nothing visibly out of place. But the behavior didn't match. Not the sound. Yes, not the movement, not the environment. I stepped closer to the center. The effect deepened. Not silence, control. That was the first word that felt accurate. Sound still existed, but it didn't travel freely. It stayed contained, limited to a smaller range than it should have. Every source felt isolated, disconnected from the space around it. I didn't need the equipment to confirm it anymore. I could feel it. I wrote one final line before stepping back. Then I stopped. Because something about the way the block held that silence didn't feel passive. It felt maintained. I didn't stay long after that. I stepped back toward the boundary, watching how the sound returned as I moved out. The transition reversed gradually. Noise expanded again, filling the space the way it should. By the time I reached the corner, everything was normal. I checked the recorder. The data didn't match what I had just experienced. Fluctuations, missing clarity, no clean representation of the shift. I looked back once more. From the outside, it was just another street. Nothing unusual. But standing inside it, even for a few minutes, the difference was clear. That block wasn't just quiet, it was holding the silence in place, and whatever was causing it wasn't random. I went back the next morning with a more controlled approach. The first visit had confirmed something was wrong. The second needed to explain how it worked. I brought additional equipment, but more importantly, I adjusted how I observed it. Less movement, more repetition, fixed reference points. I started outside the boundary again, same baseline as before, normal city noise, consistent airflow, predictable movement. I recorded several minutes of audio and logged environmental conditions to confirm nothing had changed externally. Then I stepped forward. The transition felt familiar, but easier to notice now that I knew what to expect. Sound didn't drop. It compressed. That was the most accurate way to describe it. It still existed, but it didn't spread. I stopped just inside the boundary and placed a small marker on the ground. Then I stepped back. From outside, it looked normal. Nothing about it suggested change. But stepping forward again, the distance between me and that marker felt slightly off. Not longer or shorter, just less defined. I logged the position and moved deeper in. Halfway to the center, I performed a basic test. I dropped a small metal tool onto the pavement. The impact was wrong. It made a sound. But the sound didn't behave normally. No echo, no decay. It existed for a moment, then stopped completely, like it had been cut off instead of fading. I repeated it. Same result. I checked the recorder. The waveform showed the impact, but it was compressed, shorter than it should have been, missing the natural tail of the sound. It wasn't being dampened gradually. It was being ended. I wrote that down immediately. Then I moved a few steps further in and repeated the test. The effect was stronger. The sound didn't last as long. The cutoff happened faster, almost immediately after contact. I ran it a third time closer to the center. Same pattern, not quieter, shorter. That distinction held across every test. I shifted focus to the air. I dropped a piece of paper from shoulder height and watched it fall. It moved straight down with no lateral drift. I waited for a passing vehicle to disturb it. Nothing happened. The air wasn't still in a natural way. It felt present, but inactive, like it wasn't interacting with anything inside the space. I tested it again, same result. I noted it and continued. There were smaller details that didn't align with normal conditions. Reflections from windows appeared slightly muted, not darker, just less defined. Light didn't scatter the way it should. Even minor movements felt slightly delayed, not enough to measure directly. I didn't rely on that yet. Instead, I moved to the center and stopped completely. I stayed still for a full minute. No wind, no background noise bleeding in from outside, no distant vibrations. The city was still there. I could see it at the edges, but none of it reached the center. That's when the difference became clear. Silence in most environments is never complete. There's always residual input, low-frequency noise, distant movement, something. This wasn't absence, it was removal, but not total. There were moments, brief and inconsistent, where I thought I could detect something beneath it. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in pressure, something too faint to define, but consistent enough to notice when I stopped moving. I tested that. I stood still, relaxed my posture, and waited. After a few seconds, it returned, the same faint sensation, just below the threshold of sound. Then I shifted my weight. It disappeared instantly. I repeated the process. Wait, detect, move, nothing. Each time, the result was the same. Whatever that signal was, it only appeared when I was completely still, and I didn't record it immediately. Instead, I stepped back toward the boundary and crossed out of the zone. The change was immediate. Sound returned fully, layered and uneven the way it should be. Air moved again. Small debris shifted along the ground. I checked the time and reviewed my notes. Everything matched. The pattern was consistent across every test. The environment inside the zone wasn't failing to produce sound. It was preventing it from continuing. That implied control. I looked back toward the center of the block, focusing on the area where the effect had been strongest. From the outside, it looked unchanged. But standing there, it hadn't felt empty. It had felt occupied, not visibly, but structurally. Like the space was being held in a state that allowed something else to exist without interference. I wrote that down last. Then I stopped. Because that conclusion didn't come from the equipment. It came from how consistent the suppression was. Too precise, too controlled, and too complete to be accidental. Whatever was inside that space wasn't just creating silence, it was maintaining it. Back at the office, I stopped treating it like a field anomaly and started treating it like a system. If the silence was being maintained, then it had structure. And if it had structure, it would repeat. I transferred all recordings, ran backups, and isolated the audio logs from both visits. Then I removed everything that wasn't directly tied to timing. No assumptions, no interpretation, just raw sequence. At first, it looked inconsistent. Then I filtered out the noise. What remained was precise. Each gap in the recording lasted the same amount of time, not approximate, exact, down to the second. There was no variation between them, even across different days. I marked one interval, then another, then all of them. The duration didn't change. That ruled out environmental interference immediately. Next, I checked the spacing between those gaps. From the start of one to the start of the next, the interval was identical. 23 minutes. No drift, no adjustment, no external influence. I cross-referenced it with everything available: traffic light cycles, transit schedules, nearby infrastructure systems. Nothing matched. The timing existed independently of anything else in the area. That was the point where it stopped being incidental. It was scheduled. I leaned back and played one of the recordings in real time. For a while, everything sounded normal. The usual city layering, engines, footsteps, into distant movement. Then, without warning, it dropped. No fade, no distortion, just gone. A few seconds later, it returned at full level, as if nothing had changed. I replayed the same segment. Then again. There was no build-up before the silence, no signal that it was about to happen. It didn't arrive gradually. It replaced what was already there. I didn't write anything down yet. Instead, I opened my field notes and aligned them with the timestamps. Every moment I had marked as pressure shift or environmental stillness matched the gaps exactly. I hadn't been tracking the timing consciously, but the pattern had been active the entire time. That meant I had already experienced it, without realizing when it started. I checked my watch logs. The times I had written manually were slightly off from the recorded timestamps. Not by much, but enough to suggest that my perception of time wasn't fully reliable inside the zone. I marked that. Then I wrote the first rule. Do not remain inside during a full cycle. I didn't frame it as a conclusion. It was a procedure. There was no data from inside those gaps, nothing recorded, nothing measurable. The only reference I had was the absence itself and how it aligned with my own notes. That wasn't enough to define what happened during those intervals, but it was enough to avoid them. I added a second line beneath it. Track time externally. Do not rely on internal estimation. Then I stopped writing, because something about the pattern still didn't fit. It wasn't just that the silence repeated, it was that it repeated without error. The next morning I returned with a synchronized timer set to the interval. I stayed outside the boundary at first, watching the time count down. I wanted to confirm the transition from a controlled position before stepping inside again. At 10 seconds out, I moved forward. Just inside the boundary, same position as before. I didn't go deeper. I didn't need to. I waited. When the timer reached 0, it happened. Everything stopped. The city didn't fade. It disconnected. I could still see movement beyond the block, but none of it reached me. No sound crossed the boundary. I stayed still. The absence was complete. I checked the timer. It was still running, but tracking it felt different. The seconds advanced, but not smoothly. Each increment felt separate, like there was no continuity between them. I didn't trust it. I kept my focus forward and waited for the return. When the silence lifted, it came back all at once. No transition, just full restoration. I stepped back immediately, crossing out of the zone without hesitation. Once outside, the difference was immediate. Sound layered normally again. Movement felt continuous. Time felt stable. I checked the timer. The duration matched exactly. No variation. I wrote everything down while it was still clear. Then I added one more line beneath the first rule. If timing becomes uncertain, assume the cycle has already started. I closed the notebook and looked back at the block. From the outside, nothing had changed. But now I knew the silence wasn't random. It wasn't environmental. It was structured, and whatever was maintaining it wasn't making mistakes. After confirming the timing pattern, I stopped focusing only on the environment. The zone wasn't just affecting sound. It was affecting how people moved through it. That part had been there from the beginning, but I hadn't measured it properly, so I did. I positioned myself across the street with a clear view of the entire block and started logging foot traffic manually. Entry points, direction changes, time spent inside. Nothing complex, just consistent observation. At first it looked normal. People approached from different directions, walking at typical pace, following predictable routes. But the longer I watched, the more the pattern separated itself from the background. Most of them didn't enter directly. They adjusted. The correction was small, sometimes just a step or two, but it happened consistently. People angled toward the edges of the block without pausing, without looking down, without any visible awareness that they were changing direction. And they didn't hesitate. They didn't notice. They just avoided the center. I marked each path as it happened. Over time, the pattern held. Those who did cross through the middle moved differently, slightly faster, more direct, not running, not reacting, just reducing the time they spent inside without any clear reason. I tracked several individuals from entry to exit. None of them stopped. None of them looked around. None of them behaved like they were aware of any change in the environment. I tested recall. I stopped a man just after he crossed part of the block and asked if he noticed anything unusual about the area. He didn't hesitate. Said no. I asked him to describe the space he had just walked through. Traffic. Buildings. Nothing else. No mention of the silence. No uncertainty. His answer matched what he would have said about any other street. I let him go. Then I repeated the test with 2 others. Same result. No one reported anything out of place. That didn't match what I had experienced inside. The difference in sound was obvious. It wasn't subtle enough to miss if someone was paying attention. But the responses suggested they weren't registering it at all, or not in a way that remained once they left. I changed the approach. Instead of asking about the environment, I asked a woman to describe the exact path she had taken across the block. She started to answer, then paused, corrected herself. The route she described didn't match what I had just observed. She seemed certain. But it was wrong in a way that wasn't random. It followed a cleaner path than the one she had actually taken. I didn't correct her. I just wrote it down. Then I checked the timer. A cycle was approaching. I stayed outside and watched how people moved during the peak interval. There was no change. Pedestrians continued to avoid the center. Vehicles continued to pass through without stopping. No one reacted to the silence activating inside the block. Even when it reached full suppression, nothing in their behavior shifted. That meant the effect wasn't limited to sound. It was affecting awareness. I considered the possibility that people noticed something in the moment but didn't retain it. That would explain the lack of recall, but not the path adjustments before entry. Those corrections happened in advance, before full exposure. I tested that. I positioned myself just outside the boundary and focused on approaching pedestrians. And several altered their path within a few steps of the edge, redirecting without breaking pace. No one looked down. No one paused. The movement was automatic. I marked the positions where those changes occurred. Then I stepped back and compared them to the boundary I had recorded earlier. They aligned, not perfectly, but close enough to confirm a relationship. I wrote a new line in my notebook. Prolonged exposure may reduce awareness of the zone. Then I added another. Initial contact may trigger unconscious avoidance. I didn't know if either was complete, but both matched the data. I checked my own notes from earlier visits. There were moments where details felt less distinct after I left. Not missing, but less certain. Like the memory didn't hold the same weight once I was outside the boundary. I hadn't written that down at the time. Now I did. Because if the zone interfered with perception while inside and disrupted recall afterward, then documenting it required a different approach. Memory wasn't reliable, not fully. I underlined that once. Then closed the notebook, because the pattern didn't just explain why people avoided the area. It explained why no one reported it, and why something like this could exist in the middle of the city without ever being acknowledged. Not hidden, just not recognized. Up to that point, I had been working around the cycle, not through it. I entered, observed, and left before the interval reset. The rule was simple. Do not remain inside during a full cycle. It wasn't based on complete data. It was based on what was missing. There was no reliable record of what happened during those periods. That made it a gap, and gaps tend to get filled. I went back in the afternoon with the timer already synchronized. This time, I didn't stop at the edge. I walked directly to the center of the block and stayed there. No adjustments, no early exit. If the pattern was consistent, then staying through it would confirm what the recordings couldn't capture. I checked the time and logged my position. Then I waited. At first, it felt familiar. The contained sound, the still air, the absence of movement between structures. Nothing that hadn't been there before. That was the problem. It was becoming easier to ignore. I wrote that down. At 5 minutes before the cycle, I checked both recorders. Active, no instability. The timer matched my watch. At 1 minute, I stopped moving completely. I focused on fixed points. The edge of the pavement, a doorway across the street, the position of my hands. I needed something stable to compare against once the cycle began. At 0, everything stopped. No fade, no transition, just absence. The silence wasn't quiet, it was complete. For a moment, nothing else changed. No pressure shift, no visible distortion, just the removal of all external sound. Then the delay started. I lifted my hand slightly. The movement happened, but the recognition of it didn't align. There was a fraction of separation between action and awareness. Not enough to stop the motion, but enough to notice it wasn't synchronized. I lowered it and tried again. Same result. I shifted my weight. Balance held, but the sense of it lagged behind. My body moved normally, but the feedback didn't arrive when it should. I checked the timer. The display was visible, but the second changes felt inconsistent. Each increment appeared separate, like there was no continuous flow between them. I tried counting internally. That failed almost immediately. The spacing between numbers stretched and collapsed without warning. There was no stable rhythm to hold on to. I stopped trying. Instead, I stayed still. Breathing became difficult to track. Not physically. I was still breathing, but without sound, it felt disconnected. I placed a hand against my chest just to confirm it was happening. It was, but it didn't feel anchored. The longer I remained inside, the more distant everything felt. Not physically distant, structurally disconnected, like the environment was still there. But my link to it had been reduced. I didn't know how long I stayed like that. The timer continued, but I couldn't rely on my perception of it. There was no consistent reference point left. time wasn't moving the way I expected it to. Then, without warning, it ended. Sound returned all at once. Traffic, voices, movement. Everything came back at full level, restoring the environment without any transition. I stepped back immediately. Crossing the boundary reset everything. Movement felt aligned again. Time felt continuous. The delay disappeared as soon as I was out. I checked the timer. The duration matched the previous cycles exactly. No variation. I logged the result. Then I added a new rule. Remaining inside during a full cycle disrupts perception of time and movement. I paused before writing anything else, because the effect hadn't felt random. It hadn't felt like something breaking down. It had felt controlled, like the silence wasn't just removing sound. It was creating a condition, one where normal sensory feedback didn't apply. I closed the notebook and looked back toward the center of the block. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, during that interval, the environment hadn't just gone silent. It had operated differently, and whatever caused that wasn't passive. It was maintaining those conditions with precision, exactly the same way, every time. After the last cycle, I reduced my exposure again. Short entries, fixed paths, no unnecessary movement. The rules were holding so far, and I didn't have a reason to push beyond them yet. But even within those limits, something else started to stand out. It wasn't immediate. It showed up in small inconsistencies, things that were easy to dismiss if I wasn't looking for them. I noticed it first in a window. The glass was dark enough to reflect movement clearly. I stopped in front of it and raised my hand slowly, watching the reflection instead of the motion itself. For a moment, everything aligned. Then it didn't. The reflection followed, but not at the same time. There was a slight delay between the movement and the mirrored response. Not enough to register at normal speed, but when I slowed down, it became obvious. I lowered my hand and repeated it. Same delay. I stepped back out of the zone and ran the same test. No delay. I stepped forward again. It returned. I marked the position and wrote it down. Then I checked shadows. Standing under a streetlight, I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My shadow responded, but not immediately. It held its previous position for a fraction longer than it should have before adjusting. I turned quickly. For a moment, it didn't move at all. Then it snapped into place. I stopped moving. At rest, everything aligned again. No distortion, no delay. The inconsistency only appeared during motion. That mattered. It meant the effect wasn't constant. It was conditional. I tested it again using a different light source. Same result, then another. No change. The delay remained consistent regardless of where I stood inside the zone, though it seemed slightly stronger closer to the center. I marked that on the map, even though I already knew the map wasn't fully reliable anymore. I needed the reference anyway. Next, I tested alignment between movement and distance. I picked a fixed point, a corner of a building, and walked toward it slowly, watching how the space closed between us. The distance reduced normally, but the sense of it didn't. It felt uneven, not physically, perceptually, like the space wasn't updating in real time as I moved through it. I stopped halfway and looked back. The distance behind me felt longer than it should have. I didn't trust that alone, so I measured it. Step count. Same method as before. The numbers matched. The space hadn't changed, only my perception of it had. I wrote that down. Then I added a line beneath it. Do not rely on visual confirmation inside the zone. It wasn't a theory. It was a procedural adjustment. If movement and visual feedback weren't aligned, then anything based on sight alone introduced error. Small at first, but enough to matter under the right conditions. I tested that directly. And I placed a small object on the ground and reached for it, watching my hand, the motion completed, but the visual feedback lagged behind just enough to disrupt timing. My hand made contact before it appeared to. I repeated it without looking. The movement felt normal. That confirmed it. The delay was visual, not physical. I stood there for a moment, letting that settle. Sound was being suppressed. Time perception broke during cycles. Now visual processing was slightly out of sync. Each layer on its own was manageable. Together, they removed any reliable point of reference. I stepped back toward the boundary and stopped just before crossing out. From that position, I could see into the zone while still standing outside it. The delay wasn't visible from there. Movement inside appeared normal as long as I wasn't fully within the boundary. That meant the effect depended on where I was, not just what I was observing. I wrote that down last. Then I added one more line beneath the others. If visual feedback becomes unreliable, reduce movement and use fixed reference points only. I closed the notebook. Because at that point, it wasn't just about documenting the anomaly anymore. It was about maintaining enough consistency to move through it without making a mistake, and the margin for error was getting smaller. I didn't notice the gap while it was happening. That was the first problem. I entered the zone with the timer already running, well within the safe window before the next cycle. The plan was simple. Check one interior structure along the east side, confirm measurements, and leave before the interval reset. Nothing outside that. I followed the same entry path as before, and marking my position against external reference points. The building I chose was a narrow commercial unit, closed, with a recessed entrance and no visible activity inside. I logged the time and stepped in. The silence felt closer indoors, not stronger, just more contained. Sound didn't travel beyond a few feet. My own movement stayed local, as if it didn't extend past the immediate space around me. I wrote that down and moved further inside. The layout was straightforward. Front room, narrow corridor, rear exit. I started with the perimeter, checking walls and corners for any spatial inconsistencies. Everything appeared stable. I remember reaching the back doorway. I remember checking my watch. After that, there's nothing. No transition, no sense of movement. The next moment, I was standing near the front entrance again, facing the street, holding my notebook mid-entry. The pen was still touching the page, but the line I had been writing didn't match the previous one. It continued from a point I didn't remember reaching. I stopped immediately. The timer was still running. I checked it. The time didn't match. I should have had several minutes left before the next cycle. But the display showed less than 30 seconds. I had no record of the time between those 2 points, and no memory of moving back to the front of the building. I stepped outside without finishing the note. The shift in sound hit immediately, restoring the usual city noise, but it didn't correct the gap. I stood there, trying to reconstruct the sequence. Entry, perimeter check, rear doorway, then nothing. I opened the notebook again. The handwriting was mine. The observations matched my usual format. Short, imprecise, consistent, but the order didn't hold. Entries that should have come later were written earlier. Lines overlapped in a way that didn't match a continuous process. I flipped back a page. Same issue. The content was there. The sequence wasn't. I checked the recorder. The device had been active the entire time. No shutdown, no interruption. But there were sections where the waveform dropped completely, flat, empty segments where audio should have been recorded. Those gaps didn't match the cycle. They occurred outside the known interval. I marked that. Then I checked the timestamps. From the moment I entered the building to the moment I stepped back onto the street, there was a discrepancy of just over 8 minutes. 8 minutes I couldn't account for. I wrote it down. Unaccounted time can occur outside peak cycles. Then I added another line beneath it. Memory cannot be relied on inside enclosed spaces. I paused, because something about that didn't feel complete. It wasn't just that I had lost time. It was that I had continued working through it. The notes proved that. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't reacted. Whatever happened during that gap, it didn't interrupt behavior. It removed awareness of it. I looked back at the building. From the outside, nothing had changed. Same closed entrance. Same inactive interior. No visible difference from any other unit on the block. But I had been inside, for longer than I remembered. I checked the timer again, less than a minute until the next cycle. This time, I didn't stay. I moved away from the boundary completely, putting distance between myself and the block until the environment felt stable again. And then I stopped and reviewed everything a second time. The data was still there. The gap was still there. And there was no indication of what had happened during it. Only that I had been present. And I hadn't noticed anything was wrong until it was already over. I wrote one final line before closing the notebook. If time is lost, assume activity occurred. I didn't expand on it, because I didn't have anything to confirm what that activity was. Only that it had happened, without interruption, without awareness, and without leaving anything behind except the record that I had continued working through it. After the gap, I stopped assuming I was the first to document it. The reports suggested otherwise. But reports can be incomplete. Data can be lost. Physical traces are harder to remove, unless something actively interferes with them. So, I started looking for those. I returned early, before the area filled with foot traffic. The conditions were stable. Baseline noise outside, controlled suppression inside. I stayed near the edge at first, confirming the boundary hadn't shifted beyond what I had already recorded. Then I moved in. I followed a consistent path toward the center, checking the positions where I had previously placed markers. A few were gone, not displaced. Gone. No residue. No sign they had been removed manually. The ground where they had been placed was undisturbed. I marked the absence and continued. That's when I saw it, a marking on the wall. It wasn't visible from a distance. Only when I moved closer and adjusted my angle did it become clear. The surface had been cut, not scratched. Lines pressed into it with enough force to leave a permanent impression. Deliberate. I stepped closer and checked the orientation. It faced inward, toward the center of the block, not outward. That mattered. It wasn't meant for someone passing by. It was meant for someone already inside. I copied it into my notebook exactly as it appeared. Do not stay for the second. No punctuation, no signature. The spacing was uneven, like it had been done quickly, without time to correct it. I checked the surrounding walls. There were more markings, less clear, some incomplete. Others partially worn down to the point where only fragments remained. A few looked like they had been started but never finished. I documented each one as best I could. Then I stepped back and reviewed the message. Second wasn't defined. It could mean a second interval, a second exposure, a second cycle. But given what I had already experienced, one interpretation made more sense than the others. A full cycle inside the zone. I had already done that once, and I had already seen what it did. I checked the timer, still within a safe window. Then I left the zone and returned to the office. I pulled the older records tied to that location. There was a name. It appeared across multiple reports over several months, all linked to the same type of anomaly: sensor failures, incomplete data, environmental interference. The reports followed the same pattern as mine, started with observation, moved into pattern recognition, then stopped, no resolution. The final entry listed a resignation, no explanation attached. I accessed the archived logs connected to those reports. Most of the data was unusable, corrupted or incomplete. But a few fragments remained. Timestamps, partial notes, references to irregular intervals that matched what I had been documenting. The language was consistent, technical, procedural, no speculation, no mention of anything beyond measurable effects. There was no reference to the markings. That didn't mean they weren't there. It meant they hadn't been preserved. I went back the next morning to confirm. The markings were still there, but not exactly. The main message was visible, but the edges had softened. The depth of the cut seemed reduced, as if the surface had shifted slightly. The smaller markings were harder to identify. A few that I had documented the day before were no longer clear enough to read. I compared them to my notes. There were differences, not large enough to prove change with certainty, but enough to make the comparison unreliable. I logged it. Physical evidence may degrade within the zone. Then I looked at the message again. Do not stay for the second. It wasn't written as a suggestion. It was a warning, and it had been left by someone who had followed the same process I was following now. Observe, record, identify patterns, establish rules. At some point, they had decided that wasn't enough. They needed something that wouldn't disappear when the data did. So they carved it into the structure itself, which meant they expected everything else to fail, or be removed. I stepped back from the wall and checked the timer. Another cycle was approaching. This time, I didn't stay to observe it. I had already confirmed the pattern, and now I had confirmation of something else. Someone had reached the same conclusions before me, and whatever had happened after that had been enough to make them leave. Without finishing the work, without explaining why, just one message, left behind in a place where it wasn't supposed to be seen, unless you were already inside. After finding the markings, I stopped treating the silence as complete. Up to that point, it had been consistent. During peak intervals, nothing existed within it. No residual noise, no distortion, no variation, just absence. That assumption didn't hold anymore. I returned with the same setup. Timer synchronized, position near the boundary, minimal movement. I wasn't there to test new variables. I was there to confirm whether the silence behaved the same way under controlled conditions. At 10 seconds before the next cycle, I stepped inside. Not far, just enough to be fully within the zone. I stayed facing forward, using the edge of the pavement and a parked vehicle outside the boundary as fixed references. I didn't move once I was in position. The timer reached 0. The silence activated. Everything stopped. No ambient noise. No background input. The city continued beyond the block, but none of it reached me. The separation was immediate and complete. I waited. 5 seconds. Nothing. Then it happened. A single footstep. Behind me. Clear. Defined. Close enough to place. But not close enough to measure precisely. It didn't echo. It didn't fade. It existed briefly, then stopped. I didn't turn. I marked the timing mentally, aligning it with the cycle. The sound didn't occur at the transition. It happened after the silence had already stabilized. That mattered. I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to confirm my own position. No sound. I took a slow step backward. Still nothing. The footstep I had heard didn't match my movement. I stopped again, waited. 10 seconds passed, no repetition. Then I moved my hand slightly, just enough to create motion. Nothing. Another step. Behind me. Same spacing, same clarity, independent of anything I was doing. I wrote one word in my notebook without looking down. Footstep. The pen moved across the page, but I couldn't hear it. I didn't try to confirm the sound again. I didn't turn. There was no rule for this yet. But reacting introduced variables I couldn't measure. Everything I had documented so far suggested one consistent approach. Do not engage with anything that doesn't follow the established pattern. This didn't follow the pattern, so I held position. The timer continued running. I tracked it visually, even though the progression felt uneven. Each second appeared disconnected from the last, but the count held. The silence remained unchanged. No additional sound. No movement. Then, as I shifted my weight again, the sound repeated. Another step. Closer, not by much, but enough to register. I stopped moving completely. The next part was important. The sound didn't occur again. Not while I stayed still. That established a condition. It responded to movement, not directly. There was no exact synchronization, but the spacing suggested a relationship. I added that mentally. Do not move. The timer approached the end of the cycle. I kept my posture steady, resisting the urge to step back or turn around. The boundary was only a few steps away, but distance wasn't the variable that mattered. Movement was. When the silence lifted, it did so instantly. Sound returned at full level. Traffic, voices, everything at once. I stepped out immediately. Crossing the boundary restored normal alignment. Sound carried again. Movement felt consistent. Time felt continuous. I turned back. Nothing. The block looked the same as before. No visible presence. No indication that anything had been there during the cycle. I checked the recorder. The waveform showed complete suppression during the interval. No spike. No anomaly. No record of the sound I had heard. I checked the backup device. Same result. The sound hadn't been captured. I wrote everything down while it was still clear. Timing, position, sequence. Then I added a new rule beneath the others. If a sound occurs during peak silence, do not respond. I paused before adding anything else, because the implication was already clear. The silence wasn't empty. Something inside it could produce sound without being affected by the suppression, or it wasn't being suppressed at all. I closed the notebook and looked back at the block. The conditions hadn't changed, but now I knew something else existed within them, something that didn't follow the same rules, and something that only became noticeable once I stayed long enough to hear it. After the footsteps, I stopped treating movement inside the zone as reliable. Up to that point, I had been mapping it, nothing detailed, just enough to track positions and move without hesitation. Entry points, distances between structures, consistent paths. That stopped working. I noticed it during what should have been a routine pass along the western side. I followed a path I had taken multiple times before, counting steps between two fixed references, a recessed doorway and a utility pole just outside the boundary. The count didn't match. I reached the doorway too early. At first, I assumed I had miscounted. That was still possible, especially with the visual delay affecting timing. I stepped back to the starting point and repeated the path, marking each step in my notebook as I moved. Same result, fewer steps. I checked the distance visually. It looked the same. No compression, no shift in the structure. The space between the 2 points appeared unchanged. But the measurement didn't agree. I wrote it down and moved to a different section of the block. Same test, same discrepancy. Distances that had been consistent before were now slightly reduced. Not enough to notice without measuring, but enough to disrupt any attempt at precision. I pulled out the map I had been building and aligned it with my current position. It didn't fit. The layout was close enough to recognize major features, but the spacing between them had shifted. Corners didn't meet at the same angles. Straight paths required minor adjustments to follow. Nothing drastic, nothing stable either. I marked my position relative to the nearest building and corrected the layout. Then I moved forward using the updated reference. A few steps in, it stopped matching again. I paused. From where I was standing, everything appeared normal. Buildings were intact. Lines were straight. Nothing visibly distorted. But the relationships between those elements didn't hold over time. I checked the timer. No cycle. This wasn't tied to peak silence. It was constant. I moved to the boundary, stepped outside, measured the same distance again. The count matched my previous records exactly. No variation. Then I stepped back in, repeated the test. The discrepancy returned. That confirmed it. The issue wasn't in the method. It was in the space. I wrote a new rule. Do not rely on previous spatial layouts. Then I added another. Reconfirm position continuously. I didn't know what was causing the shift. The buildings weren't moving. Their positions relative to the surrounding streets remained fixed. But inside the zone, the internal spacing between points wasn't stable. It wasn't drifting. It was resetting or adjusting. I needed to know if it changed during movement or between observations. So, I tested it. I placed markers along a straight path at fixed step intervals, creating a controlled line through the center of the block. Then I walked the path again, checking alignment against each marker. It held. I waited, then walked it again, still aligned. Then I turned around and followed the same path in reverse. The spacing felt different. I checked the markers. They hadn't moved. But the distance between them no longer matched the steps I had used to place them. The markers were fixed. The space between them wasn't. I didn't try to correct it. I removed the markers instead. Then I stepped back toward the boundary and stopped just outside. From there, everything looked stable. Distances appeared normal. Layouts made sense. Nothing suggested change. But I had measured it multiple times, and each time the result shifted. That meant I couldn't rely on paths inside the zone, not even ones I had just created. I added one more line beneath the others. If a path changes, assume it will not revert. I closed the notebook. Because the implication was clear, navigation inside the zone wasn't just unreliable, It was actively misleading. And if that shift happened during a cycle, when time and perception were already unstable, there wouldn't be a reliable way to correct it. Not fast enough, not accurately, and not before it mattered. By that point, I stopped trying to map the zone. Structure wasn't stable enough to matter, and relying on it had already introduced errors. What remained consistent were the cycles. The silence followed timing. The distortion followed the silence. So I focused on that. I positioned myself just inside the boundary, far enough to experience the full effect, but close enough to exit without delay. The timer was synchronized. I kept my posture steady and reduced movement to a minimum. Observation meant waiting. When the cycle began, the transition happened as expected. Sound dropped out completely. No residual noise. No bleed from outside. The separation was immediate and complete. I stayed still, keeping my attention forward, avoiding any unnecessary movement that might interfere with what I was trying to observe. For a few seconds, nothing changed. Then the space ahead of me shifted. Not physically. The buildings didn't move. The ground didn't drop. But the alignment between them changed. Edges bent slightly. Straight lines didn't hold. It lasted less than a second. Then it reset. I fixed my focus on a doorway across the street, used it as a reference point. A few seconds later, it's the same distortion passed through it. The vertical edge bent inward, just enough to register, then returned to its original position. I didn't move. I wrote one word without looking down. Distortion. Then I kept watching. The pattern repeated, but not in the same place. The shift appeared again, several feet to the left of the doorway, then again further along the pavement. Each time, the same effect. Brief misalignment, then correction. It was moving, not randomly, in a path, slow, consistent. I tracked it as best I could without turning my head too quickly. The distortion crossed the center of the block, affecting everything in its path in small, measurable ways. Edges bent, space compressed slightly, then returned. No sound, no visible source, only the effect. I marked the direction mentally. It was moving toward the opposite side of the block. Then it changed. Not speed, direction. The distortion shifted slightly off its path, adjusting by a few degrees, then continued. That wasn't random, it was controlled. I stayed still. The previous rule still applied. Do not respond. The distortion passed within a few steps of my position. The effect intensified. Lines broke more noticeably. The ground ahead of me seemed to misalign for longer before correcting. The closer it got, the more the space struggled to hold its shape. I didn't look directly at it. I focused on the ground instead. A crack in the pavement, a fixed line. When the distortion crossed it, the line bent, then straightened again. That confirmed it. The effect wasn't in my perception. It was in the space. The distortion continued past me, toward the boundary. Then it stopped, not at the edge, just short of it. The space around that point held its misalignment slightly longer than before, as if something was still present there, occupying that position without resolving into form. I didn't move. The timer was still running. The cycle hadn't ended. For the first time, I considered a different interpretation. The silence wasn't just removing sound. It was maintaining a condition. And whatever was moving through it existed within that condition without being affected by it. After a few seconds, the distortion shifted again. This time, it moved slower, less direct. It didn't follow a straight path anymore. It adjusted in small increments, covering a narrower area, as if focusing. I stayed still, There was no clear indication of what it was reacting to, but the behavior had changed. When the silence lifted, the distortion disappeared immediately. No transition, no residual effect. The environment returned to normal alignment, as if nothing had passed through it. I stepped back out of the zone without hesitation. Once outside, I reviewed what I had recorded. Then I added a new rule. Movement can occur within the silence without producing sound. I paused before writing anything else. Because the pattern I had observed didn't match passive movement, it followed a path, it adjusted direction, and it stopped before reaching the boundary, as if it recognized the limit or chose not to cross it. I closed the notebook, because at that point, the conclusion wasn't theoretical anymore. The silence wasn't empty, something was moving inside it, and it was aware of the space it occupied. I didn't return immediately after that. Up to that point, the behavior inside the zone had followed patterns. Even when those patterns were difficult to measure, they held. The distortion moved along a path. The silence followed a cycle. Then it changed direction. That wasn't part of the pattern. I went through my notes again before going back. Position, timing, duration inside the zone. I looked for anything that could explain the shift. There was nothing obvious. I had followed the same procedures as before. Minimal movement, no response. Controlled exposure. Still, something had changed. When I returned, I stayed outside the boundary longer than usual. I watched the block from across the street, tracking movement the way I had earlier. Pedestrians still adjusted their paths without noticing. Traffic still moved through without interruption. On the surface, and everything was consistent. But I wasn't looking at the environment anymore. I was waiting for the cycle. When the timer aligned, I stepped inside. Same position as before, just within the boundary, with a clear line of sight toward the center. I stopped moving. When the silence activated, I held position. The first few seconds passed without change. Then the distortion appeared, not across the block, closer. It started a few feet in front of me, affecting the ground directly ahead. The pavement bent slightly, the same way I had seen before. But this time, it didn't pass through. It stayed. I didn't move. I kept my focus on a fixed point, a crack in the pavement, watching how it distorted, then partially corrected, then distorted again. The effect held in place. That was new. Then I noticed my shadow. It wasn't moving. I shifted my weight slightly, just enough to confirm. The shadow stayed where it was. No delay, no correction. It remained fixed, as if it had separated from my movement entirely. I stopped. The distortion ahead of me changed. It moved, toward me, not quickly, not directly, but the distance between us reduced, a few inches at a time, controlled. I didn't step back. Movement had already shown a pattern. It triggered response. The safest option was to remain still until I understood the condition. The distortion adjusted again, closer. The space around it broke down more noticeably. Lines bent further. Edges held their distortion longer before returning to normal. The effect was centered on me. That was the point where the pattern became clear. It wasn't moving through the space anymore. It was adjusting relative to my position, tracking. I checked the timer. The cycle wasn't over. I stayed still. There was no rule for this yet, but the previous ones still applied. Do not respond. Do not rely on perception. Do not assume stability. The distortion stopped again, closer than before. The air felt different, not in temperature or pressure, but in how it held, like the space between points had tightened slightly. I didn't try to measure it. I didn't move. For several seconds, nothing changed. The distortion held its position, maintained distance. Then, without warning, my shadow snapped back into place. At the same moment, the silence lifted. Sound returned all at once. Traffic, voices, movement, everything restored instantly. I stepped back out of the zone without hesitation. Once outside, I turned. Nothing. The block looked unchanged. No visible sign of what had just happened. No distortion, no movement. I checked the recorder. No anomaly, no sound, no record of the event. I wrote everything down immediately. Position, timing, distance. Then I added a new rule. If the distortion changes direction or closes distance, assume detection. I paused, then added one more. Do not remain in place once detection is suspected. I closed the notebook. Because the behavior I had just observed wasn't environmental. It wasn't random. It had adjusted to me, maintained distance, then held position. That wasn't passive. That was response. And it meant something inside. The silence wasn't just moving through it anymore. It was aware of where I was, and it had chosen to stop. I didn't go back after that. There wasn't a reason to. The pattern had already broken. Up to that point, the rules had been enough to manage exposure, even if they didn't explain what was happening. Once the distortion started tracking position, those rules stopped being reliable. I filed the report the next morning. Sensor interference. Inconclusive cause. No action required. It followed the same format as the others. Neutral. Incomplete. Easy to archive. There was no way to describe what I had observed in a system that required measurable confirmation. The report went through without review. That should have ended it. For a few days, it did. I went back to routine work. Standard inspections, data verification, nothing outside normal parameters. The city sounded the way it always does. Layered, continuous, consistent. Then the gap started again. Not in the system, in the environment. The first time, I almost missed it. I was at my desk, reviewing a set of unrelated logs, when the background noise in the room shifted, not silent, just reduced, like the sound had been pulled inward for a second. Then it returned. No one else reacted. I didn't record it. The second time, I did. Same effect. Short duration. No visible cause. I checked the system logs immediately after. No anomaly. The recorders didn't capture it. Only I did. I wrote it down. Over the next week, it happened more often. Always brief. No consistent timing. No pattern I could align with anything external. I started checking reflections again. The delay was there, not constant, but present, in glass surfaces, in polished metal. Small movements would register slightly late, then correct themselves immediately. I tested it in different parts of the city. Same result. Not everywhere, but not limited to the original block. I stopped going near that area entirely. There was no reason to confirm anything there anymore. The data I had was already incomplete. Returning wouldn't change that. I reviewed my notes instead. Every rule I had written still applied. Do not remain inside during a full cycle. Do not rely on visual confirmation. Do not respond to sound within the silence. Do not trust spatial consistency. They all describe the zone, but I wasn't inside it anymore. I checked the timestamps of the moments I had recorded outside. There was no cycle, no 23-minute interval, no predictable pattern. That was the first clear break. Whatever I was experiencing now wasn't tied to the original structure. I went back to the earliest entries. First visit, second visit, Every step after that, I looked for anything that had changed over time, anything that had expanded beyond the boundary I had marked. The only constant was exposure. The more time I had spent inside, the more detailed my observations became. The more I focused on it, the more consistent the effects appeared, not stronger, just easier to notice. That was the connection, not location, not duration, awareness. I wrote it down. Then I stopped, because writing it made it clearer. The zone didn't need to expand physically, it only needed to be recognized. Everything inside it had followed that pattern. People avoided it without knowing why. Data failed to capture it. Memory didn't hold it properly. It didn't force itself into awareness. It waited for it. I closed the notebook because at that point, documenting it wasn't helping. It was reinforcing it, and I started paying attention to something else instead. The consistency of sound, the bass line, the way the city normally holds together, because the gaps were easier to notice now. Short, controlled, sometimes no more than a second, but they were there. I didn't try to measure them anymore. I didn't log them. I didn't test them. I just noted when they happened, and when they didn't. The last time it occurred, I didn't check anything. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just waited. The silence passed. Sound returned. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. My shadow. It corrected itself a second late. Just once. Then it aligned. I didn't write it down. I didn't confirm it. I just stepped away from the window and left the room. Because at that point, the pattern was clear enough. It didn't stay in that block. It didn't stay contained. It followed the same rule as everything else inside it. It remained where it was observed, and I had spent too much time observing it. So I stopped, not because it ended, but because continuing to track it felt like the only way it could continue. It didn't stay there, and I didn't need to go back to know that.